Hi, so we are students at Wellesley College, and our project is assessing bias in the original and multiracial reading the mind in the eyes test.
Okay, so just a little bit of background about the RMET. So it's used often in research on autism spectrum disorder and in clinical practice. And participants are, for the test, presented with photos of the eye region, and they're asked to match these photos with one of 4 mental state words. However, the original RMET has some flaws. First of all, the photos are all in black and white, and they're only Caucasian faces. And second, they use very unintuitive sets of vocabulary that aren't common in everyday language. So because of these flaws, a new RMET was updated with faces of a variety of races and ethnicities, and the vocabulary was made less complex and more intuitive. So because of these changes, we asked the question, does this updated MRMET really eliminate the biases that have been identified in the original RMET?
So in order to test this, what we did was administer a set of tests online, and we used testmybrain.org, which is a research website where a lot of researchers, especially at McLean Hospital right now, are administering tests. And the 2 tests that we administered were RMET and MRMET. And the demographics of the people who use this website are majority female and majority Caucasian. From these people, what we saw was the overall score distribution on the left-hand side in color coded blue and orange. In blue, we see that there's a slight skew, which is the original RMET, to have a slight ceiling effect, whereas for the MRMET, there's less of a skew. And this reflects the changes that the test developers decided to use so that there's more precision and less ceiling effect for the MRMET. And so the first thing that we assessed was how well the test correlates with itself, also known as internal reliability. And then based on how well the tests correlate with itself, how well the tests correlate with each other. And so the correlation within the test or internal reliability is in gray. And we can see that the internal reliability for both the MRMET and the RMET are pretty similar. And then if you look at the white boxes, which are the across test correlation or between test correlation, we can see that the tests correlate as well with each other as they do with themselves, which suggests that it's the maximum, approximately the maximum amount of correlation that they can achieve, which is good. And it suggests that the 2 tests are very similar.
To select the best model for our analysis, we fit 4 linear regression models that predicted scores on the original RMET based on combinations of ethnicity, gender, native language, and education. And then we chose the model that minimized the Akaikis and Bayesian information criteria and the residual variance. And then we performed, and that model included linear terms for ethnicity, gender, and native language. And then we performed cross-validation by splitting our data set into train and test samples and calculating the root mean square error for both groups. And we found that the root mean square error was similar for both groups, which indicates that there's not evidence of overfitting. But when we then fit that model to predict MRMET scores, we found that the root mean square error increased, which tells us that the relationship between these predictors and the MRMET scores is different in some way from the relationship between these predictors and the original RMET scores. And then what we did is we made a new model that we fit to the MRMET scores using the same predictors and found that the root mean square error decreased and was actually slightly lower than that of the original model on the original RMET, which tells us that it's indicative of better fit and suggests that the MRMET may still have bias based on these factors.
So in terms of demographic trends, we firstly observed that the updated RMET had overall lower scores in most of the demographic groups. And something that's interesting that we observed is that the non-European demographic group did much more poorly than the fully or partly European groups. And so something that we're going to touch on a bit later is how we think that this could be due to the biased way in which the correct answers of the test were even determined in the first place.
Yeah, so just to tease these subgroups apart a little bit and kind of look at what's happening, we did some post-hoc Tukey tests, and we found that there were significant differences in performance between European and non-European groups, and then non-European and mixed or partly European groups. And these were significant for both the RMET as well as the updated MRMET. And then we did the same thing for gender and found significant differences between female and male groups and genderqueer and male groups, again, for both tests. And going back to what Harshini said about the non-Europeans faring more poorly than the other groups, the correct answers were determined using a citizen science consensus method, which used a majority white and European participants. So this suggests that it might be due to this bias in the determination of correct answers, as opposed to some sort of inherent difference in emotion cognition ability.
Sorry. And then finally, we looked at the validity of both tests. And so this is an edition of the paper that we originally submitted. And what we wanted to see is, since these tests are used for testing certain psychological constructs like theory of mind or how well people perceive emotion, we wanted to see if the relationship between each test with autism spectrum quotient and vocabulary are similar. And we see indeed that these tests both fare very similarly. So whether it be for autism spectrum quotients or for vocabulary or working memory, which are depicted on the left for autism and then right for working memory and vocab, we see that both tests fare very similarly, suggesting that they have approximately similar or equally good or equally bad, however you want to see it, validity for these different psychological constructs.
Yeah, so overall, we conclude that that MRMET led to lower scores in most of the demographic groups, and that the model using ethnicity, gender, and native language didn't really predict the MRMET data as well as the RMET data did. And finally, something that we should definitely consider with this data is that the sample population was self-selected because of the online testing platform. And so it's really hard to know whether these results can be generalized.